Reviewing old drone footage, a man spots a tent nobody ever noticed. The dust motes danced in the projector beam, a swirling galaxy of dead skin and forgotten years. Elias sat in the dark. The only light, the cold, digital glow of the past. His basement office smelled of stale coffee and ozone, the scent of a man who spent more time with ghosts than with the living. On the wall, a vast high-resolution image of the Kandahar province stretched a tapestry of beige and brown, death and dirt. It was a map of his own private hell, projected from a hard drive that hummed like a trapped hornet. He wasn't supposed to have this footage, terabytes of it. Every mission, every sortie, every silent, detached flight of the Reaper drone he'd piloted from a windowless box in Nevada, half a world away. It was a violation of a dozen protocols, a felony by any sane measure, but sanity had left him long ago, somewhere over the Helmand River, replaced by a gnawing, insatiable need to understand. To watch, to find the exact moment his soul had fractured. His call sign had been Ghost. A cruel irony, he thought now. He was the one who was haunted. His hand, scarred and trembling slightly, moved the mouse. The cursor, a tiny crosshair, skittered across the satellite projection. He was reviewing Operation Night Adder, a de-weeding mission from 2012. The official report was thin: 3 confirmed insurgent kills, 0 civilian casualties. A clean, successful operation. Elias remembered the relief, the hollow back, from the commander who smelled of cheap cologne and ambition. A good kill, a good day. But his dreams told a different story. Screaming he couldn't hear, faces he couldn't see. A weight on his conscience that grew heavier with each passing year. A tumor of unspoken guilt. So he watched. He'd spent 3 years of his so-called retirement in this chair, reflying his missions, frame by agonizing frame. His wife had called it an obsession. Then she'd called it grounds for divorce. Now, she didn't call at all. He zoomed in on a sector designated 7 Delta. The drone's camera feed filled the wall. The landscape shifting from a god's eye view to something more intimate, more predatory. The Reaper had been flying low that day, its shadow, a fleeting cross against the sun-baked earth. The terrain was a brutalist sculpture of jagged rocks and deep ravines, a place where a man could disappear forever. The mission had been simple: identify and eliminate a known facilitator codenamed the Gardener. They'd tracked him to this desolate stretch of badlands. The infrared feed had lit up 3 figures huddled near a rocky outcrop. 3 hot signatures, 3 distinct targets. The commander's voice, tinny through the headset of memory, had been clear: Ghost, you are weapons free. Prosecute all targets. Elias had squeezed the trigger on his joystick. The Hellfire missile, a whisper on his end, a roaring apocalypse on the other, had streaked across the screen. He watched it again now, for the 100th time. The silent flash, the bloom of fire and smoke. The 3 bright signatures vanishing into a cloud of expanding heat. Clean, successful. His finger twitched on the mouse, ready to move on, but something held him. A flicker. He'd seen it 1,000 times and never seen it. A tiny, almost imperceptible anomaly in the visual data. A pixel that was the wrong color. His heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against the silence of the room. He rewound the footage, his breath held tight in his chest. He played it again, his eyes straining, scanning the periphery. Away from the focal point of the blast, their dot in the bottom left corner of the frame. Tucked deep into the shadow of a canyon wall, was a smudge of blue, a deep, unnatural cobalt blue, the color of a child's forgotten toy or a summer sky. In the monochrome world of the Afghan desert, it was as loud as a scream. What the hell, he whispered. The sound swallowed by the thick soundproofed walls. His hands, suddenly slick with sweat, worked the controls. He magnified the sector, the pixels sharpening, resolving into a clearer image. The smudge wasn't a smudge, it was fabric. Taut, stretched fabric. The corner of a tent, a small, dome-shaped camping tent. Its nylon skin a defiant splash of color against the unrelenting ochre of the earth. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up his spine. He was a master of this terrain. He knew every rock, every shadow. His eyes had been trained to see the unseeable, to spot the telltale signs of human presence. A discarded cigarette, a footprint, a patch of disturbed soil, a tent, even a small one, was an elephant in a broom closet. How had he missed it? How had everyone missed it? He cross-referenced the coordinates with a mission log. The green text of the official report glowing on a secondary monitor. Sector 7 Delta, pre-strike reconnaissance. No non-combatant presence detected. Area sterile, post-strike assessment. No collateral structures identified. Sterile. The word was a lie. A blatant, unforgivable lie. His mind raced. The tent was at least 500 meters from the strike zone, shielded by a ridge. The occupants, if there were any, would have been safe from the blast itself. But the shockwave, the terror. He had to see it better. He pushed the enhancement software to its limits, the computer's fans kicking into a frantic whir. The image degraded, dissolving into a noisy mosaic of digital squares, but the shape held. A tent, a small, cheap, civilian tent. The kind a family might use for a weekend camping trip, not the kind of tactical gear used by insurgents. And then he saw it. Just outside the unzipped flap of the tent, half buried in the dust, was something else. Not blue, this time, red. A small plastic red. He zoomed again, the software fighting him, the image threatening to break apart completely. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it was a flower. A poppy blooming in defiance of the desolation. But it wasn't a flower, it had wheels, of them, and a ladder on its side. It was a toy fire truck. The air rushed out of Elias's lungs in a ragged gasp. The basement suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. The hum of the hard drive swelled into the deafening roar of the Reaper's engine. He could feel the phantom vibration of the controls under his palms. The cool sweat trickling down his temples in the Nevada bunker, a toy, a child's toy, dot in a sterile zone. He wasn't just looking at an intelligence failure anymore. This wasn't a mistake. This was a cover-up. The tent, the toy. They were evidence of a life, a family, a child, in a place they were never supposed to be, a place that had been wiped from the official record. He frantically scrolled through the footage. Fast-forwarding past the strike, he needed to see what happened after. Did the drone circle back? Did it ever look at that corner of the canyon? Again, for 10 minutes of flight time, the camera stayed locked on the smoldering crater, assessing the damage, confirming the kills. Then, the drone banked, turning for its return flight to base. For a fleeting second, just 2 or 3 frames of video, the camera panned across the canyon again. Elias slowed it down, advancing it frame by agonizing frame. The tent was still there, but the flap, which had been open, was now closed, and the toy truck was gone. A wave of nausea washed over him. Someone had been in that tent. Someone had survived the strike. Someone had stepped outside, seen the carnage, 500 meters away, and in a moment of unimaginable terror and grief, had remembered to bring their child's toy back inside. Or maybe a child had grabbed it themselves. He kept watching, his eyes burning, his throat raw. The drone flew on, oblivious. The canyon shrank, the blue tent disappearing back into the shadows, the land becoming a flat, featureless map once more. For the next 8 hours of footage, until the drone landed, the camera never looked back. It was as if it had never been there, wiped clean. A ghost in the machine. But Elias had seen it. His curse had become a crucible. He was the only one who knew. The official report was a lie. The clean, successful mission was a blood-soaked fabrication. And somewhere, in the desolate wasteland of Kandahar, in the shadow of a forgotten canyon, a small blue tent held a secret that could unravel everything. He leaned forward, his forehead pressed against the cool, smooth surface of the projection wall. The image of the empty desert stared back at him, mocking him with its silence. The toy truck was burned into his retinas. He couldn't unsee it. He couldn't unknow it. He pushed himself away from the wall, his chair scraping loudly in the stillness. He walked over to a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the room, his movements stiff, robotic. He fumbled with the key, his hand shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get it into the lock. Inside were his service medals, his commendations, a folded flag, the relics of a life he'd once been proud of. He pushed them aside, reaching for a false bottom at the back of the drawer. Beneath it lay a single, sealed envelope. It was his unofficial mission log, a diary of doubts and fears he'd kept in violation of every rule. He'd written it for his own sanity, a place to confess the things he couldn't say out loud. He also had a list. The names of every person on his crew for Operation Night Adder, the sensor operator, the intel analyst, the commander who gave the order, Major Thomas Croft, a man who now held a cushy, high-level position at the Pentagon, a man who preached about honor and integrity while sitting on a throne of lies. The weight of the secret settled on him, heavy as a shroud. He was a witness, a silent, unknowing witness to what? A tragedy, a crime, a massacre. He looked back at the wall, at the single frozen frame of the blue tent, and the ghost of a red toy truck. He was Ghost, the pilot who flew unseen. But for the first time, he felt like he was the one who had truly been blind. The cliffhanger wasn't in the footage, it was here, in this suffocating basement, with a truth that screamed to be heard, and a silence that was killing him. He had to know what happened in that tent. He had to know who he had really been shooting at that day. The thought was a hook, and it was pulling him back into the war he'd never really left. He thought of Croft, with his polished shoes and political smile. He thought of the clean report, the lie that had been entered into history. An injustice, deep and profound, had been committed, not just to the people in that tent, but to him. They had used him. They had made him an accomplice to their secrets. The rage began as a low burn in his belly, a pilot light of fury that had been waiting years for fuel. The footage was the fuel. His life as a quiet, haunted retiree was over. He knew it with a chilling certainty. He couldn't live with this knowledge, this ghost. He had to follow it, back into the heart of the darkness, no matter the cost. He picked up the phone. His fingers, still trembling, dialed a number he hadn't called in years. A man who was even more of a ghost than he was. A former intelligence asset, a man who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Zahir, Elias, breathed into the phone when a quiet voice answered. "It's Ghost. I need your help. I need you to find a family, or their graves." The mission wasn't over. It had just begun. And this time, he wouldn't be flying from a distance. This time, he was going to walk into the fire himself. He looked at the toy truck in his mind's eye. A tiny piece of red plastic against an empire of lies. It was a war he was destined to lose. But as he stood there in the dark, the ghosts of Kandahar swirling around him, he knew he was going to fight it anyway. He had to. For the child who played with a fire truck in the shadow of death. For himself. He had to find the truth, even if it buried him. The victim was a girl named Anila. She was 9 years old, and her world was the size of the small cobalt blue tent she shared with her father, Omar. Omar was a teacher, or he had been, before. The war had burned the school, and the books, and the future. Now he was just a man trying to keep his daughter alive, a fugitive from a world that had no place for them. They had fled their village after a night raid had taken Anila's mother and brothers, a case of mistaken identity that the soldiers had simply called bad intel. Omar, a gentle man with ink-stained fingers and a love for poetry, had become a ghost, hiding in the most desolate corners of a land he no longer recognized. Anila's only connection to the world they'd lost was the small, red toy fire truck. Her brother had given her chakaried it everywhere, its plastic wheels tracing imaginary roads in the dust, a talisman against the encroaching silence. Her laughter, when it came, was a rare and fragile thing, a wildflower pushing through concrete. She would sit in the tent's opening, her dark eyes scanning the vast, empty landscape, humming a tune her mother used to sing. She was waiting for the world to remember she existed. The antagonist was Major Thomas Croft. To the world, he was a decorated war hero, a fast-rising star in the Pentagon. He had a strong jaw, a photogenic family, and a knack for saying the right things about honor and sacrifice. But beneath the polished veneer was a man hollowed out by ambition. Croft's secret was that he was a coward. Not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, carpeted offices where careers were made and broken. Operation Night Adder had been his ticket to a promotion. He'd been under pressure to produce results, to deliver a high-value target. The gardener was that target. The intel that led them to Sector 7 Delta was thin, cobbled together from an unreliable informant. Croft knew it was a gamble. When the pre-strike drone sweep showed the blue tent, he had a choice. Acknowledging a civilian presence would have meant scrubbing the mission, a black mark on his record, a delay that would have displeased his superiors. So he made a decision. In the sterile air-conditioned quiet of the command bunker, he ordered the intel analyst to log the area as sterile. He told himself the tent was probably abandoned. He told himself it was a justifiable risk. He buried the truth under a mountain of paperwork and ambition, and when the mission was declared a success, he accepted the congratulations with a steady hand and a clear conscience. The blue tent became his secret. A small price to pay for a brilliant career. The hidden witness was a young airman named Chris Keller. He had been the sensor operator on Ilias's crew that day. A kid barely out of his teens, his face still soft, with the last vestiges of boyhood. It was his job to operate the drone's camera, to be Ilias's eyes. He was the one who first saw the blue tent. He'd flagged it, his voice a nervous squeak in the comms channel. "Sir, I have a possible structure. Civilian, Croft's voice had come back, sharp and impatient. "Airman, I'm looking at the same feed. It's a shadow on the rocks." Stay focused on the primary. Chris, intimidated and eager to please, had backed down. He'd thought he was mistaken, that the Major, with his experience, saw things more clearly. But the image of the tent, and the flicker of blue, had stayed with him. He saw it in his nightmares. After the strike, consumed by a guilt he couldn't articulate, he requested the post-strike imagery. He found the same frame Elias would find years later. The frame with the closed tent flap and the missing toy. Chris knew. He knew what Croft had done. The knowledge terrified him. He was a low-level airman, a nobody. Croft was a major, a powerful man on his way to becoming a general. To speak up would be career suicide, or worse. So he buried the secret, let the guilt fester. He left the Air Force a year later, haunted and broken, and took a dead-end job as a security guard, watching monitors in a dark room, a pathetic echo of the life he'd left behind. He was a ghost of a different kind, haunted not by what he had done, but by what he had failed to do. The lives of these three people, a child, a careerist, and a coward, were bound together by a single moment in time, a lie broadcast from a sterile room in Nevada. Ilias, now holding the key, did not yet know their names, but he could feel their presence in the silent footage. His investigation began with a name, Chris Keller. He was the easiest to find, a footnote in the mission roster. Elias drove for 6 hours to a run-down apartment complex in a forgotten corner of Arizona. He found Chris sitting in his small, sparsely furnished living room, the blinds drawn, a bottle of cheap whiskey on the table beside him. "Airman Keller," Ilias said, standing in the doorway. Chris looked up, his eyes hollow, unfocused. He was thin, his face pale and etched with a premature weariness. "Who's asking?" "I was your pilot," Ilias said, stepping inside. "Operation Night Adder." The name hit Chris like a physical blow. He flinched, his body tensing. The whiskey bottle rattled as he reached for it. "I don't remember," he lied, his voice hoarse. "I do," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "I remember everything. And I've been watching the tapes." He paused, letting the words hang in the stale air. "I saw the tent." Chris squeezed. His eyes shut. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. The bravado crumbled, replaced by a wave of raw, shuddering relief. He had carried the secret alone for so long, and the weight had crushed him. "I told him," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I told him it was there. He said it was a shadow." "Who did you tell?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. Croft, Chris said, the name tasting like poison. Major Croft, he was running the show. He told me to shut up and focus. The two men sat in silence for a long time, two broken pieces of the same machine. Elias listened as Chris poured out the story, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. He described the moment he saw the tent, the condescending dismissal from Croft, the gnawing certainty that he had been complicit in something terrible. I saw the post-strike feed, Chris confessed, his gaze fixed on the floor. The toy was gone. I knew someone was alive in there. I knew, and I did nothing. Elias felt a surge of pity for the young man, but it was quickly overshadowed by a cold, hardening anger. Croft hadn't just made a mistake, he had intimidated a subordinate into silence. He had actively, consciously, chosen to bury the truth, where truth is. Croft now? Elias asked. Pentagon, Chris said with a bitter laugh. Deputy director of something or other. He's untouchable. No one's untouchable, Elias said. The words feeling like a vow, his next step was to find the ghost he'd called in the night. Zahir was a legend in the intelligence community, a former Afghan operative who had worked with US forces before the withdrawal. He was a man who knew the tribes, the valleys, the secrets. He owed Elias his life, a debt Elias was now calling in. They met in a dimly lit tea house in Virginia, a world away from the dust of Kandahar. Zahir was older now, his face a roadmap of hard-won survival, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. Elias laid out the story, showing him the coordinates, the still frame of the blue tent. Zahir studied the image, his expression unreadable. This area is the territory of the Ishatsi, Zahir said, his voice a low rumble. They are a proud people, fiercely independent. They would not shelter insurgents. I need to know who was in that tent, Zahir, Elias said. A man and a child. I think. A little girl. Zahir nodded slowly. Finding ghosts is difficult. Finding the graves of ghosts is sometimes easier. This will take time, and it will be dangerous. I don't care about the danger, Elias said. I care about the truth. While Zahir began his search in the labyrinthine networks of his homeland, Elias turned his attention to Croft. He couldn't confront him directly. He needed leverage. He needed proof. He started digging, using his old intel skills to comb through public records, social media, anything that could give him a picture of the man. He found the polished facade, the charity dinners, the gushing interviews, the carefully curated image of a patriot and family man. But Elias knew that men like Croft always had cracks in their armor. He just had to find them. He rewatched the mission footage, but this time he wasn't looking at the strike zone. He was listening. He isolated the audio from the command channel, filtering out the static, amplifying the background chatter. He listened to Croft's voice, the calm, authoritative tone he used to give the kill order. And then he heard something else. A faint voice, in the background on Croft's end. A woman's voice, laughing. Elias's blood ran cold. He replayed it again and again. It was unmistakable. While he and Chris were in a darkened, silent bunker in Nevada, their hearts pounding, their souls on the line, Major Thomas Croft had been somewhere else. Somewhere with a woman. He hadn't been in the command bunker at all. He had been on the phone. He had ordered the death of 3 people, and potentially a family, while he was on a casual phone call. The callousness of it, the sheer, staggering disrespect for the lives he was destroying, was breathtaking. Croft hadn't just been ambitious. He was a sociopath. This was the crack in the armor. This was the leverage. A decorated officer, a supposed leader of men, had called in a kill order from outside the secure command center. It was a massive breach of protocol, a firing offense, possibly even a court-martialable one. It proved that Croft's attention wasn't on the mission, it was elsewhere. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Croft's motive, career advancement. His method, falsifying intelligence and intimidating a subordinate. His crime, negligent homicide, at the very least. A cover-up at the highest. Levels. Weeks turned into a month. Ilias's life became a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days. He and Chris spoke often, their shared secret forging an unlikely bond. Chris, emboldened by Elias's determination, began to remember other details. A name the unreliable informant Croft had used. A man named Rasul. A known swindler who sold fabricated intel to the highest bidder. It was another piece of the puzzle. Croft had likely paid Rasul for intel that would justify a strike, any strike, in that sector. Then, the call came. It was Zahir. His voice was grim. "I found them," he said. "Them?" Elias asked, his heart seizing. "They're alive." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "No," Zahir said softly. "I found their graves, a man and a little girl, buried together by a village elder a few days after the strike. The elder said the man was a teacher. His name was Omar. The girl, she was called Anila." Elias closed his eyes. The names gave the ghosts a face. Omar, Anila, a teacher, and his daughter. "How did they die?" Elias asked, his voice a raw whisper. "The elder doesn't know for sure," Zahir said. "He found them in the tent. There were no marks on them. He said it was like their hearts had just stopped." From the fear, Zahir paused. He said the girl was clutching a small red toy, a truck. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a crushing weight in Ilias's chest. They hadn't been killed by the missile. They had been killed by the terror, killed by the sound of Croft's ambition roaring across the sky. They had died alone in a cold, dark tent, their hearts giving out from sheer fright. Croft hadn't just killed 3 insurgents. He had killed a family. He had killed a 9-year-old girl. "There's more," Zahir said, his voice hardening. Omar was not from that area. He was a fugitive. The Taliban had put a price on his head, not because he was an insurgent, but because he was teaching girls how to read. The final piece clicked into place, and the picture it revealed was one of soul-crushing cruelty. Omar wasn't a threat. He was the opposite. He was a man of peace, a man of knowledge, a man who represented everything they were supposed to be fighting for. And Croft, in his blind, selfish ambition, had ordered his execution and, in doing so, had murdered his innocent child. The system hadn't just failed, it had been perverted. It had been used to destroy the very people it was meant to protect. "Elias," Zahir said, his voice pulling him back from the abyss. "The informant, Rasul, he is the one who told Croft that Omar was the gardener." He lied. "He sold Omar to you to settle a personal grudge and collect a bounty from the Taliban." The conspiracy was complete. A chain of lies, greed, and cowardice, stretching from a greedy informant in Afghanistan to a decorated officer in the Pentagon, and in the middle was Elias, the man who had pulled the trigger, the man who had been the weapon. The rage in his belly was no longer a pilot light, it was a furnace. He wasn't just seeking truth anymore, he was seeking vengeance. For Omar, for Chris, for himself, and most of all, for Anila, the little girl with the red fire truck, who had died of fear in the dark. The escalation began subtly, a ripple in the placid surface of Croft's carefully constructed life. Elias started with an anonymous email sent from a public library computer, a single grainy image attached, the blue tent in the shadow of the canyon. There was no text, no demand, just the image. A ghost from his past, appearing in his inbox. Elias imagined Croft seeing it. The flicker of confusion, then the dawning recognition, the cold sweat, the panicked check of his secure files, his old mission logs. The email was a stone tossed into the water, and Elias waited, patiently, for the ripples to reach the shore. A week later, a second email. This time, it was an audio file. The isolated command channel from Operation Night Adder, Croft's comm. Authoritative voice giving the kill order, and underneath it, faint but clear, the sound of a woman laughing. Again, no text. No explanation. Just the raw, damning evidence of his negligence. The effect was immediate. Elias, using a simple tracking program, saw that the file was opened multiple times from an IP address originating at the Pentagon. Croft was spooked. He was checking, rechecking, trying to understand the source of the threat. The cruelty of the campaign was in its precision. Elias wasn't attacking Croft's career, not yet. He was attacking his psyche. He wanted Croft to feel the same gnawing dread that Chris Keller had lived with for years. He wanted him to be haunted. Anila's face, a photograph Zahir had managed to procure from a distant relative, was his anchor. A small, solemn girl with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 sorrows. He had the photo taped to the monitor in his basement. He was doing this for her. He would not let her death be a footnote in a liar's service record. The victim of Croft's escalating paranoia was his wife, Catherine, a political lobbyist with her own ambitions. She had been his partner. In the climb to the top, she noticed the change in him almost immediately. He became distant, irritable, his nights filled with restless tossing. He started drinking more heavily, the expensive scotch in his study depleting at an alarming rate. "What's wrong, Tom?" she asked one evening, as he stood staring out the window of their sprawling Virginia home. "Nothing," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "Just work." "It's not just work," she pressed, her voice laced with a frustration that had been building for weeks. "You're a ghost in this house, you're jumpy, you're not sleeping. Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I said it's nothing," he roared, turning to face her. His face was pale, his eyes wild with a fear he couldn't name. The mask of the calm, confident Major was slipping, revealing the panicked coward beneath. Catherine recoiled, shocked by his ferocity. She had never seen him like this. The first crack in their perfect life had appeared. The witness, Chris Keller, was struggling with his own demons. Elias's reappearance in his life had been a catalyst, stirring the dormant embers of his guilt. He wanted to help, to see justice done, but he was terrified. Croft was a powerful man, with powerful friends. Chris was a nobody, a broken ex-airman with a drinking problem. "I can't testify, Elias," he said during one of their nightly phone calls. "He'll destroy me. He'll say I'm unstable, that I have a grudge. They'll believe him, not me. He's already destroyed you, Chris," Elias said, his voice hard but not unkind. "You've been living in a prison of his making for 10 years. Isn't it time you walked out?" Elias knew he was pushing him, but he needed a human voice to back up the digital evidence. He needed a witness who could sit in a courtroom and say, "I was there, I told him." Croft, meanwhile, was growing bolder in his attempts to identify his tormentor. He used his connections in the intelligence community to try and trace the emails. But Elias was too careful, bouncing his signals through a dozen overseas servers. Frustrated, Croft's paranoia began to curdle into aggression. He became convinced the threat was internal, someone from his past, someone from the mission. His gaze fell on the only other person who had questioned the call that day, Chris Keller. He had his people run a check on Keller. The report that came back was exactly what he'd hoped for. A dishonorable discharge which Croft had quietly arranged. A history of alcohol abuse. A string of failed jobs. A perfect target for discreditation. One evening, as Chris was walking home from his security job, 2 men in dark suits stepped out of an unmarked sedan. They weren't police, they were private contractors, the kind of men powerful people hired to do their dirty work. "Chris Keller," one of them asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Chris's blood ran cold. He tried to walk away, but the other man blocked his path. "Major Croft sends his regards," the first man said, his lips twisting into a smirk. "He knows you've been talking. He wants you to know that's a bad idea. For your health." They didn't lay a finger on him. They didn't have to. The larger of the 2 men simply cracked his knuckles, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the quiet street. The message was clear. Chris stumbled back to his apartment, his body shaking uncontrollably. He called Elias, his voice a frantic whisper. "They found me, Elias. Croft's guys. They threatened me. I can't do this. I'm out." "Listen to me, Chris," Elias said, his own heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. This is what he does. He intimidates, he bullies. If you back down now, he wins. He buries Anila and her father forever. I don't care. I can't end up in a ditch somewhere, Chris sobbed. The call ended. Ilias was alone again. He had pushed Chris too far, and now Croft had pushed back. The injustice was no longer a historical event. It was active. It was escalating. It was brutal. Croft wasn't just covering up a past crime. He was committing new ones to protect his secrets. Elias knew he had to change tactics. The anonymous campaign of psychological warfare was failing. He needed to apply pressure from a different direction. He needed to make the conspiracy bigger than just Croft. He needed to make it a public scandal. He spent days researching Croft's career, his promotions, his network of allies. He found a pattern. Every step up the ladder for Croft had been facilitated by one man, General Mark Thompson. Now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Thompson had been Croft's mentor, his patron. He had signed off on the glowing after-action report for Operation Night Adder. The same report that had recommended Croft for a commendation and a promotion. Thompson was either complicit in the cover-up, or he had been willfully blind. Either way, his name on that report tied him to the lie. This was the key. An attack on Croft could be dismissed as the grudge of a disgruntled subordinate. An attack on the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was a national security issue. Elias drafted a new email. This one wasn't anonymous. It was addressed directly to General Thompson, CCing the Inspector General's office and the Internal Affairs Division of the Air Force. The subject line was simple: Operation Night Adder. The body of the email was a concise, factual summary of the events. It included the coordinates of the tent, the names of Omar and Anila, the evidence of the falsified report, and Chris Keller's official, albeit ignored, flagging of a civilian presence. It mentioned the informant, Russell, and the bounty. And it ended with a single, damning question. General Thompson, were you aware that the commendation you approved for Major Croft was based on a mission that resulted in the deaths of a teacher and his 9-year-old daughter, and that the official report was deliberately falsified to conceal this fact? He attached the files, the image of the tent, the audio of Croft's negligent call, and a new filer-sworn, notarized affidavit from Chris Keller. After the visit from Croft's thugs, Chris had hit rock bottom. He had spent a full day drunk, trying to erase the memory of their faces, the coldness in their eyes, but as the alcohol wore off, it was replaced by a different emotion. Not fear, but a white-hot rage. They had threatened him. They had treated him like garbage. They had tried to silence him, just as Croft had silenced him 10 years ago, and he was done being silent. He called Elias back. "I'll do it," he'd said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'll sign whatever you need. I'll testify. I don't care what happens to me anymore. He has to pay." Elias hit send. The bomb had been dropped. Not a Hellfire missile this time, but a digital one, aimed at the very heart of the military establishment. The silence that followed was deafening. For 48 hours, there was nothing. No reply, no acknowledgement. Elias knew what was happening. Behind the firewalls of the Pentagon, a storm was raging. Panic, damage control. Meetings in soundproof rooms. Thompson and Croft huddled together, their careers on the line, trying to figure out how to survive the blast. The first sign of the fallout came not from the military, but from the press. A tenacious investigative journalist named Sarah Jenkins, who had sources deep inside the Pentagon, got a whiff of the story. Someone had leaked the email. Jenkins called Elias. He had been expecting the call. He had anonymously tipped her off himself. "I have an email here that's setting the Pentagon on fire," she said, her voice sharp and intelligent. "It has your name on it. Are you ready to go on the record?" "Not yet," Ilias said. The story isn't complete. He knew that going public now would just result in a flurry of denials, a carefully managed PR campaign. Croft and Thompson would circle the wagons, discredit him and Chris, and bury the story under a mountain of no comments. He needed one more thing, an undeniable confession. He needed the final plot twist, and he knew just how to get it. He told Sarah Jenkins to wait, to hold the story for 48 hours. He promised her it would be worth it. He was setting a trap. Croft, cornered and desperate, would make a mistake. Elias was counting on it. He was about to escalate the conflict from a battle of emails to a direct confrontation. The tension was at its breaking point. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The twist came not from a dusty file or a forgotten hard drive, but from a calculated gamble. Elias knew that Croft, now facing an official inquiry from the Inspector General, was a caged animal. He would be paranoid, desperate, and prone to making a fatal error. The key was to force his hand, to create a situation so volatile he would have no choice but to reveal himself. Ilias's plan was audacious and incredibly risky. It involved using the one piece of the puzzle Croft didn't know he had, Zahir. Through his contacts, Zahir located the informant, Rasul. The man who had sold Omar's life for a handful of dollars was living in a luxury apartment in Dubai. Grown fat and complacent on the blood money he'd earned over the years. He was the root of the lie, the starting point of the entire conspiracy. Ilias sent Croft one last anonymous message. It was a photograph. A recent high-resolution picture of Rasul, sitting at a cafe in Dubai, a smug smile on his face. Underneath the photo was a single line of text. He talks, you fall. He's ready to talk. It was a bluff. Rasul had no intention of talking, but Croft didn't know that. All he saw was the linchpin of his entire cover-up. A world away and seemingly out of his control, he would panic. He would do something reckless to silence Rasul for good. Elias was betting Croft wouldn't trust a third party to handle it. After the failure of his thugs to intimidate Chris, he would want to handle this himself. He would have to make contact. Elias had Zahir's team put Rasul under 24/7 surveillance. They bugged his apartment, his phone, his car. They waited. The bait was taken less than 12 hours later. An encrypted call came through to Rasul's burner phone. It was Croft. His voice was strained, the polished baritone frayed with panic. "We have a problem," Croft said, without identifying himself. "I have no problem," Rasul replied, his voice oily with false confidence. "I am enjoying my retirement." "Someone knows about Omar," Croft hissed. "They know you lied, they have proof." Rasul's confidence evaporated. "Who had it?" "It doesn't matter," Croft snapped. "What matters is containment. I need you to disappear." "A long vacation? South America, maybe." "I'll wire you the funds. Just get out of sight until this blows over." "And if I don't?" Rasul asked, a hint of his old greed creeping back into his voice. "Perhaps I need more funds." For my silence, there was a long, cold pause on Croft's end. Then, his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "You don't seem to understand the situation, you greedy little rat. This isn't a negotiation. You will do what I say. Or, the next people who come to visit you won't be as polite as I am. They will put you and your entire family in a box. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Rasul stammered, his bravado gone. "I understand." "Good," Croft said. "I'll be in touch with the details." The call ended. Elias, listening in from his basement in Virginia, felt a grim satisfaction. He had it, a direct recorded threat. Croft, conspiring to obstruct justice and silence a witness. It was the nail for his coffin, but it wasn't enough. The recording implicated Croft, but it didn't fully expose the depth of the rot. It didn't touch General Thompson. It didn't reveal the full scope of the cover-up. Elias wanted more than just Croft's head on a platter. He wanted to burn the whole corrupt system to the ground. He needed a public confession. He sent the recording of the call to Sarah Jenkins. "This is what you've been waiting for," he told her. "But it's off the record. For now, use it as leverage. I want an interview with Croft, and I want to be in the room." Jenkins, smelling the story of a lifetime, agreed. She was one of the few journalists the Pentagon still respected, or feared. She put in the request. A sit-down interview with Deputy Director Croft, to discuss his heroic service and the challenges of modern warfare. His office, wary of the brewing scandal from Ilias's email to the IG, saw it as a perfect PR opportunity, a chance for Croft to get ahead of the story and paint himself as a victim of a smear campaign. They eagerly accepted. The interview was set up in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, the walls adorned with official portraits of past military leaders, their painted eyes passing silent judgment. The room was rigged. With Jenkins's reluctant cooperation, Elias had a technician plant miniature cameras and microphones. Feeding a live signal to a secure server, Chris Keller was in a nearby hotel room. Watching the feed, his heart hammering against his ribs, he was the secret weapon. Elias was in the observation room next door, a one-way mirror separating him from the stage he had so carefully set. Croft walked in, flanked by two public affairs officers. He looked tired, the strain showing around his eyes, but he was composed, the mask of the honorable soldier firmly back in place. He shook Sarah Jenkins's hand, his smile practiced and confident. The interview began with softball questions. Jenkins played her part perfectly, lulling him into a false sense of security. They talked about his career, his family, his patriotism. Croft spun his narrative, the story of a man dedicated to his country. Then, Jenkins shifted gears. "Major," she said, her tone becoming more serious, "I want to ask you about a specific mission, Operation Night Adder." Croft's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "A difficult day," he said, "but a successful one. We neutralized a major terrorist threat." "There have been allegations," Jenkins said, choosing her words carefully, "that there were civilian non-combatants in the area. Specifically, a teacher named Omar and his young daughter, Anila." Croft gave a rehearsed, dismissive laugh. "Aware of the rumors, they're baseless, the product of a disgruntled former airman with a history of disciplinary problems. It's a sad attempt to tarnish the reputation of the armed forces." He was talking about Chris. This was the moment. In the hotel room, Chris took a deep breath, and, on Elias's signal, unmuted his microphone. His voice, clear and steady, filled the conference room's hidden speakers. "That's a lie," Chris said. Croft froze, his head snapped up, his eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the voice. "Who is that?" he demanded. "Know who it is, Major," Chris's voice echoed. "It's Airman Keller. The one you told to ignore, the blue tent. The one whose career you ruined because he saw something you wanted to hide." Croft's face went white. The public affairs officers were on their feet, shouting, but Jenkins waved them down. Her own cameras were rolling. "What is this?" Croft stammered, his composure shattering. "It's called the truth." Tom Ilias's voice now joined Chris's, booming through the speakers. He was standing now, his face inches from the one-way mirror, his eyes boring into the man who had destroyed so many lives. "You're in this room, Croft," Elias continued. "But you're also in a hotel room with Chris Keller, and you're in a cafe in Dubai with Rasul. We have everything. The falsified logs, your phone records, the recording of you threatening to have Rasul put in a box." Panic gave way to pure cornered animal fury. Croft shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. "This is an illegal ambush," he screamed. "This is entrapment." "Was it entrapment when you told a scared kid to ignore a civilian tent?" Ilias's voice thundered. "Was it entrapment when you ordered a missile strike while you were laughing on the phone with your mistress? Was it entrapment when you sent thugs to threaten the only man who could tell the truth?" Then, Ilias delivered the final blow. "General Thompson knows, by the way," he said, the lie delivered with absolute conviction. "He's the one who leaked my email to Jenkins. He's cutting you loose, Tom. He's saving himself." That was the twist that broke him. The thought of his mentor, his patron, betraying him was too much. The conspiracy that had protected him was now devouring him. His carefully constructed world collapsed in an instant. "No," Croft whispered, shaking his head. "No, he wouldn't." He looked at Jenkins, his eyes pleading. He wouldn't do that. His gaze was wild, unseeing. He wasn't talking to Jenkins anymore. He was talking to the ghosts in the room. "It was a shadow," he mumbled, repeating the lie he'd told himself for a decade. "It had to be a shadow." The risk was acceptable. The target was high value. He started pacing, his words becoming a frantic, rambling confession. Thompson knew. He knew the intel was thin. He told me he needed a win. He said, "Make it happen, Major." He was the one who, he signed off on it all. He had done it. He had confessed. He had implicated the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on a live feed. The public affairs officers tried to grab him, to silence him, but it was too late. The truth was out, a raging torrent that could no longer be contained. In the observation room, Elias felt no triumph, just a vast, hollow emptiness. He had won. He had exposed the lie. But it wouldn't bring back Anilla, it wouldn't heal Chris. It wouldn't erase the image of the red toy truck from his mind. Sarah Jenkins sat back in her chair. Her expression a mixture of shock and journalistic ecstasy. She had her story. A scandal that would reach the highest echelons of power. The full conspiracy, born from a single lie, was now laid bare for the world to see. The tension had snapped, and the fallout would be immense. The personal pain of 3 broken people had just become a public firestorm. The payoff was not a single explosive moment, but a cascade of them, a series of detonations that sent shockwaves from the Pentagon to the evening news. The live feed from the conference room, which Elias had anonymously leaked to a dozen media outlets the second Croft began to confess, went viral. Hashtag Pentagon Confession trended worldwide. Croft's frantic rambling admission, his pale, sweaty face, his accusation against General Thompson, it was all there, raw and unfiltered. The public justice was swift and brutal. Within hours, General Thompson announced his immediate resignation, citing personal health reasons. It was a transparent lie, a desperate attempt to cauterize the wound, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. The next morning, military police, acting on a warrant from the Inspector General, arrested Thomas Croft at his home. The image was cinematic in its own right. The decorated war hero, the man of honor, being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and ruin. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like what he was, a common criminal. Elias watched it all on television from his basement, the same room where the long journey had begun. He felt a detached sense of vindication, but the catharsis he had expected was absent. It was like watching a film of a fire he had started. The flames were spectacular, but he couldn't feel the heat. The true cinematic payoff came a week later. During the preliminary hearing of the court-martial, the courtroom was packed, a standing room-only theater for the public shaming of the powerful. Croft sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out shell of the man he had been. His lawyers were arguing for dismissal, claiming the confession was coerced. The recording illegal. The prosecution's star witness was Chris Keller when Chris walked into the courtroom. He was a changed man. He was sober, his eyes were clear, and he wore a simple, clean suit that seemed a size too big for his thin frame. He looked vulnerable, but when he took the stand and raised his right hand, his voice was steady. He told the story, he told it. All the blue tent. The flicker of doubt, Croft's dismissive voice on the comes. He described the weight of the secret, the years of guilt and fear, the visit from Croft's thugs. He spoke with a quiet dignity that filled the room, the simple, unadorned truth cutting through the legal jargon and the cynical posturing. Croft's lead attorney, a bulldog of a man named Marcus Thorne, rose for the cross-examination. His strategy was to shred Chris's credibility, to paint him as an unstable, vengeful drunk. "Mr. Keller," Thorne began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You were dishonorably discharged from the Air Force, were you not?" "Yes, sir," Chris said. "For alcohol-related incidents, correct?" "Yes, sir. So you have a history of, let's call it, unreliability, a problem with the truth perhaps." "I have a history of trying to drink away something I saw," Chris said, his voice unwavering. "Something your client ordered me to ignore." Thorne paced before the witness stand. "You claim you saw a tent, a blue tent, yet no one else saw it. Not the pilot, not the analysts back at base. Only you. Isn't it more likely, Mr. Keller, that a man with a drinking problem, under the stress of combat, simply saw a shadow? A trick of the light? I know. What I saw, Chris said. Elias, sitting in the public gallery, felt his hands clench into fists. This was the moment. He had given the prosecution a piece of evidence, something he had held back, waiting for the perfect time. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed colonel, stood up. Permission to introduce new evidence, Your Honor. Evidence that will directly corroborate the witness's testimony. The judge nodded. The colonel dimmed the courtroom lights and projected an image. Onto a large screen behind the witness stand, it was the footage from Operation Night Adder. This is the pre-strike reconnaissance feed, the colonel said. As you can see, the area is desolate, rocky, barren. Now, I'm going to apply a specialized spectral analysis filter, a technology that wasn't available 10 years ago. It's designed to detect synthetic materials, things that don't belong in the natural environment. He clicked a mouse. The image on the screen shifted. Most of the landscape remained a monochrome gray, but in the bottom left corner, a shape began to glow. A small, dome-shaped object, lit up in a brilliant, luminous blue. A gasp went through the courtroom. It was the tent, undeniable, irrefutable. A ghost made visible by technology. The colonel wasn't finished. Mr. Thorne claims that only his client's unreliable witness saw this structure. But let's look at the logs from the sensor operator's console. Let's look at Mr. Keller's screen. He projected a second image beside the first. It was a recording of Chris's own monitor from that day. On it, his cursor could be seen moving to the blue glow, circling it, tagging it with a flashing red box. A digital flag. And then, a chat window popped up on the screen, a message from the command channel. From Croft. The message read, Keller, untag the anomaly. It's a shadow. Final warning. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. It was all there, the evidence, the order to ignore it, the cover-up, happening in real time. Chris hadn't just seen the tent. He had marked it, and Croft had explicitly ordered him to delete the evidence. Chris looked at the screen, and for the first time, tears welled in his eyes. Not of fear or guilt, but of vindication. I told you, he whispered into the microphone. I told them. Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly his entire defense had been annihilated in a single cinematic moment. Croft stared at the screen, his face ashen. He looked at Chris, then at the glowing blue tent, the digital ghost that had come back to destroy him. In that moment, something inside him finally broke. The years of lies, the weight of the secret, the pressure of the trial, it all came crashing down. He lunged to his feet, shoving his lawyer aside. It wasn't my fault, he screamed, his voice a raw, desperate shriek that echoed through the silent courtroom. Thompson wanted a body count. He said, make it happen. The informant was verified. It was a legitimate target. The risk was acceptable. His frantic eyes scanned the gallery and settled on Elias. The two men locked gazes across the crowded room. Your Croft snarled, pointing a trembling finger. This is because of you. You were the pilot. You pulled the trigger. You're just as guilty as I am. Elias didn't flinch. He just stared back, his expression cold and empty. He let the accusation hang in the air. He had pulled the trigger. He was guilty. But his guilt had led him here, to this moment of public justice. Crofts had led him to commit more crimes, to threaten, to lie, to blame everyone but himself. Military police moved in, grabbing Croft, who was struggling, still screaming. A wild animal caught in a trap of his own making. As they dragged him from the courtroom, his last desperate cry hung in the air. Acceptable risk. The exposure was absolute. The trial was a formality after that. Croft was found guilty on all counts: dereliction of duty, obstruction of justice, and most damningly, negligent homicide in the deaths of Omar and Anila. The poetic twist of fate was the sentence. He was not just stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He would spend the rest of his productive life in a small, sterile room. A cage not unlike the one he had piloted the drone from. A cage not unlike the one Chris Keller had lived in for 10 years. The public scandal brought down a dozen other careers at the Pentagon. It forced a complete overhaul of the rules of engagement and the protocols for drone warfare. A new regulation was even named, unofficially, the Keller Rule, requiring a multi-person sign-off to dismiss any potential civilian sighting. Elias left the courtroom and didn't look back. The public revenge was complete. But his private war, the one against the ghosts in his own head, was far from over. He had delivered justice, but he hadn't found peace. The catharsis was for the world, for the headlines. For him, there was only the quiet, haunting echo of a mission that would never truly be over. The emotional aftermath was a long, quiet echo. There were no celebrations, no victory laps. The downfall of Croft and the exposure of the conspiracy had been a public spectacle. But the healing, for the men who had orchestrated it, was a private, painful process. Elias returned to his basement. The projector was off the wall bare. The hard drives containing the mission footage were gone, handed over as evidence. The room felt different, larger, the silence no longer oppressive, but simply empty. He had spent years staring at the past, and now, with the truth revealed, he found himself adrift in an uncertain present. He sold his house in Virginia. The house his wife had left, the house that had become a bunker. He bought a small, isolated cabin in the mountains of Montana, a place where the only humming was the wind in the pines. He needed the quiet. He needed to learn to live with the ghosts without letting them consume him. One day, a package arrived. It was from Chris Keller. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden box. Elias opened it. On a bed of velvet lay a single, tarnished silver medal. It was a medal for valor. One Chris had been awarded for a different mission. Long before Operation Night Adder, tucked beneath it was a note. Elias, it read. I don't need this anymore. I know what real courage looks like now. It's not about flying into enemy fire. It's about telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. Thank you for giving me my voice back. I'm going back to school. I'm going to be a counselor. I want to help guys like us. Maybe I can't save the world, but maybe I can save one or two of them from the basements in their heads. Your friend, Chris. Elias held the medal in his palm, its weight feeling strange and foreign. He walked outside, to a small clearing he had made behind the cabin. He had built a small memorial there, a simple cairn of river stones. It wasn't for a soldier, it was for a teacher and his daughter. He placed the medal on top of the stones, a small gleaming offering to the memory of Omar and Anila. His quest for justice had been a kind of penance, a way to atone for pulling the trigger. But he knew, standing there in the vast silence of the mountains, that there was no absolution for what he had done. He had been a weapon, and the weapon could not undo the damage it had caused. All he could do was honor the memory of the victims. Months later, another letter arrived, this one bearing an Afghan postmark. It was from Zahir. He wrote that with the fall of Croft and the subsequent scandal, international pressure had led to a new focus on rooting out corruption within the local militias that partnered with U.S. forces. The informant, Rasul, stripped of his protectors and his wealth, had been arrested by Afghan authorities. His assets were seized. Zahir had used his influence to redirect a portion of those seized funds. In Omar's village, the letter said, they have broken ground on a new building. It will be a school. And, for the first time in a generation, it will have a library. It will be called the Anila Library for Girls. Her name will not be forgotten. My friend, she is not a ghost anymore, she is a foundation. Elias read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through the tears that streamed down his face. It was not healing, not closure, but it was something close. It was meaning. Anila's death, a meaningless tragedy born of lies and ambition, had been transformed. Her legacy would be the very thing her father had died for. Knowledge. A library filled with books for girls who had been denied them. He never saw Chris again in person, but they spoke on the phone every few months. They were brothers of a strange and silent order, bound by a shared trauma. They never spoke of Operation Night Adder, They didn't need to. They talked about the weather, about fishing, about the quiet, simple things that made up their new lives. Elias spent his days hiking the mountain trails, his nights reading by the fire. He was learning to live with the silence. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would still hear the faint phantom roar of the reaper's engine. He would still see the flash of the hellfire, the bloom of fire and smoke, and always, he would see the haunting image of a small red toy truck, half buried in the dust, a tiny, fragile piece of innocence in a world that had none. The cost of the truth had been immense. It had cost Chris his youth, and Elias his soul. But, standing at his window, looking out at the rugged, beautiful, and peaceful landscape, he knew it had been worth it. The war was over. The rage was gone. All that was left was the lingering bittersweet echo of a promise kept, and the haunting reflection that some ghosts can never be truly laid to rest. They just become a part of who you are, a grave marker in the landscape of your own heart.